This project vlog has a tragic story. Come along on my creative journey in designing and fashioning a new Florentine Renaissance gown known as a Gamurra. Accompany me through all of the sometimes frustrating stages, from research, conception, and patterning, through to construction and finishing. There will be plenty of lessons learned and cheeky commentary along the way. First up, a little history. In 1468, Lucrezia de' Medici, the matron of the Medici clan, wrote to her son Lorenzo about a prospective future bride, the very noble and elegant Clarice Orsini of the powerful Roman Orsini clan. In the letter, she talks about having gotten the chance to see Clarice in her Gamurra and praised the young woman's figure as being shapely and, of course, most importantly, capable of bearing the next generation of Florence's unofficial princes. In fact, Lucrezia's assessment proved to be quite correct. Clarice gave birth to 11 children in 10 years, some of whom sadly didn't survive. The gown in question, though, was the Gamurra, the quintessential woman's garment of the Italian Renaissance. When people, even poorly informed Hollywood costume designers, imagine Italian Renaissance gowns, it is nearly always the Gamurra that they are envisaging, forming part of the foundation of a woman's ensemble for almost 100 years. This elegant, sophisticated layer served not only a practical function, but also served to promote a family's reputation, their onore, as it is called in the language of the time. As a well-gowned Contessa, I have a wide array of gamurre and cotte, but in truth, I haven't made a new one in 8 years. And the ones I have are literally wearing thin. Not exactly the best way to promote my comital onore. Although, if anyone examines my bodice that closely, they had better be a lady in waiting, or they may come to regret their life choices. Just saying. And so, back in July of 2022, as I prepared to attend a 2-week medievalist festival called Penzik, I decided that I needed a nice new Gamurra. And I wanted to draft a new pattern based on my most recent learnings of the gown in question. I mean, I had a week before the event, so plenty of time to draft and fit a new pattern, cut out all of the layers, and sew everything by hand, of course. Yeah, sure. I bet you can see where this is going. So let me start by saying that this project vlog has a tragic beginning. All of the footage of the initial stages, the patterning, the cutting, the fabric choices, the initial stages of sewing, all of the planning, that all ended up vanishing because the hard drive that contained them got corrupted before I had a chance to copy everything over, and the hard drive recovery company that we used ended up destroying the drive without actually recovering a single useful thing. Literally, we had 1,000 2-second files of footage. It was great. Anyway, thus no more footage of those stages. So, let me walk you through the crucial initial phases of the process retrospectively with as much flair as I can manage. Okay, first off, this garment is intended to be a recreation of a Gamurra dating to the 1480s in the Florentine fashion. Now, I knew that I wanted to rework the pattern that I had created based on a better understanding of the base construction of the Gamurra. The one I'd been using for 20 years was founded on a misunderstanding of a later version of the dress, and it had a seam in the front that really it just cannot be justifiably documented to my chosen era. So, great time to start fresh. Thus, after quite a bit of drafting and fiddling, I devise a bodice pattern that looks like this, designed to conform to my oddly shaped torso. You see, my left and my right half are not even vaguely symmetrical, with one side of my ribcage bulging much more than the other. And in fact, it turns out this might be true of many women. And sometimes I take this difference into account in my patterning, and sometimes I surrender to my inner pig dog, as they quaintly say in German, and just accept that there will be some discrepancies in how things sit. And sometimes my bodices are sturdy enough to enforce bilateral conformity. So if you are creating or fitting your own pattern, you might want to take bilateral torso differences into account. And then, if you do, you need to pay special attention to cutting and assembling the parts of your bodice, lest you cut or sew two of the wrong piece and you end up with something that doesn't fit any part of your body, really. Although, that being said, The sewing gods do demand habitual offerings from Suis in the form of tears and ripped seams and resewn seams. So this will happen to you at some point, just accept it. Sort of the same way that blood will be shed. And if you don't shed blood while making a dress, the dress is cursed. Take my word for this. Anywho, in this process, I also redraft my sleeve pattern, taking into account minor fitting issues from 21 years of wearing gowns with this sleeve tight. Now, part of my goal with this Gamurra is to make it much less annoyingly fiddly than my most recent cotta. In fact, many of you may know this dress. I'm aiming to simplify the dressing process for those very sad and yet frequent times when I am senza dama di corte. And the sleeves are definitely part of that simplification. The goal is to have minimum lacing while still allowing for alluring puffs of white linen to show through. After all, a 400 lady needs must show tantalizing bit of her underwear. Now, that doesn't mean no lacing, but it needs to be lacing that I can do with one hand by myself. Cheeky self-promotion time. If you are enjoying this video, please hit the thumbs up and subscribe and the notification bell if you want to know when I launch new things. And if you want to do more to support my work, then consider the super thanks button on YouTube or maybe becoming a patron on Patreon, which comes with a whole host of perks and extras like access to premium tutorials, multiple hour ones in fact, and discounts on classes. And now back to your regularly scheduled Contessa. Okay, having the bodice and the sleeves drafted, it is time to choose the fabrics. Now, I have a significant store of fabrics, silks, linens, wools, in all sorts of weaves and densities, purchased from drapers during various sales, because I'm a bit of a fabric hoarder, shall we say. Anyway, I have a particular choice of fabric in mind for this project, that being this beautiful red wool. Oh, what's that, dear viewer? That looks pink rather than red? Yeah, well, you would be correct. I ordered this wool, which was advertised as a fire engine red on eBay. Now, it was specifically intended to make a functional fantasy cloak for my 14-year-old son. Pink, while I love the color and on men too, it is definitely not my son's color and he doesn't fit with his taste at all. So this wool has sat for the last 2 years untouched, awaiting the right project. And now is its moment. Now, I know many of you, especially in warmer climes, are chortling and stating explicitly how you could never wear wool because it's too humid where you live. But hear me out. Not all wools are created the same. This here is more of a summer weight wool. Its weave is fairly loose and it has a lovely twill pattern. This wool will not only breathe, but will work with my linen camicia, my chemise, to draw heat and moisture away from my skin. Best yet, wool repels odors and stains, which is good for me because I stain my clothes easily. So no matter how much I sweat while dancing, it will resist my body's assault. I have worn wool in balmy, swampy heat, including southern summers and even during the hottest Pennsic days, and have been perfectly comfortable, or as comfortable as I would be even without any clothing on. So hashtag give wool a chance. Next up, the lining fabric or fabrics, which brings us to the topic of evidence of construction of these gowns. There are, sadly, vanishingly few extant garments from the 15th century in Europe, full stop, let alone from Italy. However, more and more are coming to light as church crypts are open for restoration work, as archaeological exploration is conducted, and as institutions also figure out what they have in their storerooms that maybe have just been sitting there for the past several hundred years. So enter then the Gamurra of the Blessed Osanna, a nun who died in 1505. She was considered so saintly and holy that the gown in which she entered the convent was preserved. Okay, well, minus large chunks of the skirt, which were probably divvied up as holy relics, so yeah. Anyway, this dress is dated to the 1460s. The gown is made from a very fine white wool and constructed very beautifully. And pertinent to our topic of the bodice, it is lined in a heavy white linen. Now, Osanna was a tween when this was made for her, maybe an early teenager, early adolescent. It did not need to provide any sort of torso support. In fact, it's very clearly aimed at someone with a flat chest. So it is not interlined or padded in any way, but I would like some more support for my bodice. So I'm going to interline it in a heavy white linen and line it in this luxurious blue linen. Now, some fashion historians or historical costumers claim that linen only came in the color of white in the Middle Ages and Renaissance. But we know this to be absolutely not true. For instance, the Irish were renowned for their saffron-dyed linea and also other saffron-dyed linen bits here and there. And we also have extant blue linen from at least the 9th century through to the 16th century, dyed in either woad or indigo. Not to mention documentary evidence. I have found a household account from Florence for a set of livery in green linen. Side note, dyeing with woad or indigo involves the use of fermented urine, the only source of ammonia in this period. Curiously, the dyeing manuals from the era recommend the urine of someone who has had strong drink, which would explain why dyers often sourced their urine from taverns, who in turn had urinals hanging from their walls to collect the horrifyingly precious substance. You know, like those clay urinals we find in all the fun medieval pottery places. That's what they were used for. Anywho, clearly the relative rarity of evidence is not proof of a negative in the case of dyed linen. And we even have a blue and white linen and wool gown from Italy dating to the mid-16th century, whose hem is finished entirely in a blue linen band. So, aside from examples of blue linen having been used for lining, this particular blue linen constitutes scraps that I have in my stores, which makes this, in my opinion, a very authentic application of fabric from a medieval standpoint. Waste not, want not, after all. As for the sleeves and lining them, I decided to go with just the blue linen lining rather than adding the white linen interlining because I'm not certain. I don't remember my logic. That footage is gone forever, but that is the decision I make based on the fact that that's the sleeve that I have now. So maybe it's to keep the gown as summer friendly as possible. I don't know. It's a decision I may come to regret because I may actually want that extra stiffness in the sleeve as I think about it now, but whatever. Okay, well, time to lay it all out and cut. Now, remember that this wool has a twill pattern, one that reflects light differently on one side versus the other, in the direction it lays. So in laying out the pattern pieces and cutting things out, I need to keep that in mind to create a consistent look in the bodice and the skirt. Otherwise, I'm going to end up with panels that look like they're lighter or darker than other when they really aren't. Nevertheless, I still work super hard to minimize the waste by placing the fabric pattern pieces as close to each other as possible and, maximizing the use of geometry in accomplishing that. For the linen lining and interlining, on the other hand, I couldn't really care about fabric direction. My goal there is simply to maximize the use of fabric because in the case of this tabby woven linen, there is no direction. Now, for the skirt pieces, Osanna's gown, the only extant 15th century Gamurra of which I'm aware, is of a style with only minor gathering in the back and a few pleats that I suspect were intended to offer room for growth because the interior seams also have extra room built into them. And the skirt of her gown consists of trapezoids. Now, the waist of my Gamurre are all pleated because this is clearly indicated in all portraits of women from Florence in this era. In fact, I've actually been cutting the skirt panels of my Gamurre as trapezoids ever since I started down my Florentine journey. The trapezoid shape minimizes the amount of fabric that must be gathered into the waist while allowing for a wonderfully long hemline and stylishly full skirts as indicated in the frescoes that depict real ladies from Florence in full length. What's more, these trapezoids also create a gorgeous flair when dancing, which would definitely be the desired effect in the 15th century Italian mindset. After all, clothing acted as a display of a family's power, their onore, and the dance floor served as a vivid stage for this. Next up in our thought process, the lining of the skirt. Now, I have never found documentary evidence for lining the skirt of a Gamurra or a cotta from this era, fully at any rate. But that is how I have designed my Gamurre until now. So, lacking that evidence, I plan on taking a different approach to this gown, one that is fully documentable in how Osanna's Gamurra is constructed and finished. You see, the skirts of her gown actually feature lining in linen down to about hip length, in pretty much the same linen that is used to line the bodice. So I'm using more of my blue linen to cut out 4 trapezoids for the skirt that will reach down to my hips. Okay, we now have almost all of our components cut out. Just one last item, famous last words. How to finish the hem. Perhaps, rather uncreatively, I am once more resorting to the hem finishing method on Osanna's gown and also actually most Italian gowns of the 16th century, that being long strips of fabric. This method is wonderful on multiple levels. One, it allows for a protected hem edge that lacks any sort of unappealing bulk of a double hemmed edge. Two, it protects not just the hem, but also the bottom several inches of the gown from wear and tear and filth. This is what it looks like, for instance, when a hemline takes a beating without this protection. The strip can then be easily replaced whenever it becomes too worn out, leaving the fashion fabric in a, well, relatively pristine state. And I say relatively because remember that in 15th century cities, it's gross out there with 100% chance of feces. Yeah, think about that for a moment. Now, I have stared long and hard at the edges of Osanna's Gamurra in pictures, as I haven't had a chance yet to see it in person on the bucket list. Anyway, it looks as though this piece is not cut on the bias. You can see this like gathering all the way around to account for the straight edge. There could be several reasons for using a straight grain strip instead of a bias cut strip. One, fabrics of this era were not very wide. 30 inches at most. So one would have to cobble together many pieces to get the amount of length, creating more points of weakness in the form of stitches and seams. Not to mention the increased labor, which might be prosaic, but still a consideration. Secondly, it looks as though the selvage has been utilized specifically for this purpose. The selvage, you see, is thicker and therefore more resilient, against wear and tear and drag, which would provide greater protection for the bottom of the gown. Third, the gathering necessary at the top of the straight grain strip to fit into the trapezoid shape will actually create some extra push, some extra bulk, which will help cause the skirt to stand out from the body in that sort of, alluring flare fashion. Also, in the case of Osanna's gown, unlike later sottane, the strip of fabric seems to be of the same cloth as the fashion fabric. So, long strips of wool it is, which is no problem because how I laid out the trapezoids. Well, everything is cut out. Time to start assembling. Because, I plan to get this done in a week, more or less. On our next thrilling episode, we will, hopefully finish this thing. So if you have any questions about the process or my choices, drop them in the comments below. What about you, dear viewer? Have you made a Gamurra? What was your biggest learning or learnings? Please do share. I love chatting up about, clothing and geekery. Otherwise, until next time, stay creative and stay tuned for your moment of kitty zen. Bye, everyone.
Meow. Meow. Meow.
Who was watching me pass by?
Meow. Flick that tail. Meow.
And now, our adventure of historical recreation continues. Let the assembling and minced meat fingers commence. I am starting with the bodice. First, I have to decide whether to use the lining to finish all of the opening edges, meaning the arm's eye and the neckline, or whether I'm going to use a different method. Well, 2 decades of having worn these gowns has taught me that I wear out the neckline and the arm's eye pretty badly. Thus, I'm going to use strips of the shell fabric to bind all the opening edges of the bodice. So that means that my first step will be to align the layers of each of the 4 sections of the bodice and baste them together to create 4 3-layer components. This step is essential to ensuring that the various layers play well together and act like one thick layer of fabric rather than having a mind of their own. Now, basting basically acts like a sort of thread glue. Of course, when basting layers of fabric together, it is super important to lay it all out carefully and first ensure that no layers are stretching along the bias. So I then pin the layers together, double checking that there are no bulges in any particular direction. At this point, I'm on my Korean Air flight to the US, so I shall be stitching while flying on a 15-hour flight. Turbulence gives sewing a certain 4th dimension it really should not have. Sitting in my spacious seat, I use a long-running stitch to glue the layers of each bodice piece together along all of the edges. Now, ideally, you will want to baste in such a way that your basting thread can be easily removed and recycled. Now that all the layers are basted, we can proceed to the next step. Honestly, I should have started by finishing the edges of the front opening of the bodice to protect those edges. Also, that would have meant less bulk to manipulate as I sew along, but in my rush to start assembling, I instead just commenced by attaching a front panel to a back panel at the side seam. It's not fatal, but it's annoying. Anyway, I use a tight back stitch for all of the interior seams of the bodice, which is what is used in Osana's bodice. FYI, I am using silk thread at this point, which I am of course waxing with beeswax. Tip: when hand sewing, remember that you always want to wax your thread. It helps prevent fraying, which happens because the thread drags in and out and in and out and in and out of the fabric as you sew along. And of course, when you're machine sewing, this doesn't happen because the thread only gets pulled out as it's needed, not repeatedly. So the wax prevents the fraying, and it also tends to reduce the frequency with which your thread engages in cheeky acts of rebellion, such as knotting. Anywho, at this point, I've reached Penzik with 3 bodice panels attached, and I'm hoping to turbo finish this Gamurra. But then, as I unpack, I discover that nearly all of my smocks are literally disintegrating and need to be reconstructed and patched if I am to actually have sufficient underthings to wear through 2 weeks of living medievally in a pavilion in the humid heat of August in Western Pennsylvania. So what this means practically, it leaves me with only a little bit of time to actually work on the Gamurra at Penzik itself. I do manage to finish all of the needful repairs to my extant clothing, so that's good. But I don't even come close to finishing this gown at Penzik. All I get done is one of the front edges, which means I am now on my return flight from Atlanta to Seoul, which will take 15 hours, thanks to Russia being a total twat. And that leaves me with plenty of time to sew. Next up, I decide to work on the sleeves, which I'm finishing by turning all of the edges in and stab stitching. Now, finishing the sleeves this way will allow me a certain flexibility in the choice of the pattern that I ultimately choose for the lace closures of my sleeves. Well, I made a pretty cardinal mistake when I was making the sleeve. I didn't line up the edges of the top half to actually make sure that both sides align. And so now I've ended up with like an extra, God, I don't know, almost ½ inch on the one side versus the other. And while they don't have to match up perfectly, a ½ inch too long on one edge is just too much. So I've made a mark, and I've had to cut off my beautiful perfect stitching and redo it. It's so frustrating to have to redo things, but honestly it's been so long since I've made these kind of sleeves or a Gamurra at all that I'm basically reinventing the wheel. Yeah, like I said, 7 years. Well, onward with in-flight sewing. So, I fold the tip of the sleeve back in, pin it, and start to re-sew it shut with a stab stitch. But before completing it, I decide to double check that it is the proper length. Learning from history and all that, about a ½ centimeter too long. So I tuck it in further and then proceed to stab stitch it shut. At this point, I run out of my white silk thread, or rather, it is vanished into the bag of holding that is my sewing bag. So I have switched to white linen thread that I purchased in the marketplace at Penzik. Although silk might be more suitable for a lady of my station, both extant garments and documentary evidence such as purchase records and household accounts do attest to the use of linen as joining thread even in an upper class setting. Oh, and also, we know that wax was used for sewing because extant textiles sometimes still have traces left on the sewing threads. So to finish the edges of the bodice, I've done a facing that you can see on garments, sometimes in paintings, and actually in the Beato Sana's edging, she has a facing as well. At least it looks like a facing. It might be the edge turned back. Either way, it's a facing in the same fabric as the shell, and I've done that here. I actually did it by folding the edges in on both sides, and I've done a stab stitch along this edge and a blind stitch along this edge because this is going to take a lot of wear and tear, and I want it to last a long time, so I want to hide as much of the stitching as possible so the thread doesn't wear away, hence the blind stitch here. This really makes a super strong edge. People ask, well, do you need to bone this? Do you need to stiffen it in some way? Well, just in interlining and an edging, and I have a pretty stiff, soft edge, shall we say. It will definitely hold its own, I'm pretty certain. Basically, we're going to be finishing the inside by cutting off the excess lining and interlining along the seam on the inside, and then folding the shell fabric over top of that and finishing that off with some blind stitches to create a really strong seam that's going to stiffen the bodice along the sides, so it kind of acts as a form of soft boning to help the bodice keep its shape even under the duress under which I put my clothing. Also, when you're sewing super thick fabric like this, I've got 6 layers I'm sewing through, 4 of which are super thick, the inner lining linen and the wool. It is so very hard to keep your stitches straight and to make them come through evenly on both sides. On one side it looks like it's super straight, and then you look at the back and you're like, holy cow, that is wonky as hell. Thankfully, the bodice is really forgiving with that kind of thickness. When you open it up, you don't see the lumpiness of the one side at all. So, the magic of fabric, what can I say? Did I mention how fun trimming seam allowances on a plane with turbulence at 35,000 feet can be? Yeah. Let's see how much more adventuresome I can make this sewing project. #Contessa silliness. Well, that silliness includes spilling whiskey from a cocktail I did not order onto the pristine sleeves. But, as you see, wool does its job and repels the assault of the distilled bog body juice. Yes, while we finish these bodice seams using a blind stitch, let's talk about this garment a bit more. In my quest to understand historic garments, I have trawled the depths of several household inventories taken at the time of various individuals' deaths, among them the intimidating inventory of the Medici Palazzo at the time of Lorenzo il Magnifico's demise in 1492. Aside from noting that the Medici were glamorous hoarders, I also remarked that the ladies of the household seemed to have few gamurre, but rather more cotte. In fact, I have only found 4 gamurre in the whole collection. 1 gamurra of gray mixed Flemish cloth with sleeves of black satin, 1 gamurra of tawny fabric without sleeves, a pink gamurra without sleeves, and a gamurra of mixed cloth belonging to Contessina. By contrast, the inventory contains a prodigious 27 cotte, all of which consist of amazingly luxurious fabrics such as velvet, brocade, and damask, conspicuous consumption at its best. So, it seems that, at least amongst the great and the good of Florence, elaborate cotte were more common than the more practical gamurre. But of course, this could be attributed to the term gamurre being a Florentine turn of phrase for a specific kind of gown. For instance, the inventory of Alessandro Ottone, Lord of Matelica, and his wife Violante Malatesta, taken in 1487, shows that Violante had 2 gamurre, one of crimson velvet and one of black figured velvet, which is a sharp contrast to the simpler fabrics of their Florentine brethren. In fact, Florentine statutes were rife with sumptuary regulations aimed at curtailing the grotesque excesses of fashion that growing wealth was spawning. So perhaps this had something to do with the distinction in Florentine nomenclature. Of course, we all know that while the patricians of Florence pretended to a middle-class simplicity that mirrored the values of the so-called Republic, in practice they were all attempting to flaunt their wealth and display familial onore and power in much the same way as the nearby courts of Milano, Ferrara, and Urbino sought to do. And many families were happy to pay the fines and flaunt their finery, making these fines more of a participation tax than a deterrent. Another fun bit of trivia: gamurre and cotte in Florence were so valuable that they were often used as surety for loans and were often confiscated by legitimate banks and less legitimate loan sharks in compensation for unpaid debts. The records of such financial institutions can therefore often provide interesting details about clothing, as every aspect of a garment was noted in detail in order to ascertain its potential resale value. Well, we are now past Penzig, and I have still not finished this gown. As I land at Incheon, I have resolved to finish it in time for my upcoming trip to Florence. What better place to debut the gown than its native city? And I have 2 whole months, so it should be a piece of cake to get it done in time. So, fast forward to October, and I am now on my way from Seoul to Florence on an epic 48-hour itinerary via Doha, Madrid, and Venice. And no, as much as this may shock you, dear viewer, the Gamurra is not yet done. In fact, not a bit more done from where we left off. So on board my Qatar Airways flight, nestled into my Q-Suite business class seat, let us continue with the bodice, specifically the shoulder seam. Now, I have decided to finish the shoulders separately before sewing them together. At this point, I'm treating the blue and white linen as one layer of fabric and the pink wool as another. I first fold the linen layers inward, pinning down the fold, and then fold the wool to match and pin it to the linen layers. Next, I baste the pinned shoulder joint and whip stitch it together with the white linen thread. Because I whip stitch it inside out, the stitches will hardly show on the outside, so the white thread is not an issue. While we stitch, though, I thought I would mention an interesting tidbit I recently learned about dyed linen fabric. Apparently, Milano was a big center of production for colored linen in this era, which was often employed for wall hangings, canopies, and curtains. So, more than just thread. Well, we are landing in Madrid en route to Venice, so we shall see you next time in Florence to continue and hopefully finish this project, which has gone from being 2 weeks long to 3 months. Whee! Until next time, stay creative and stay tuned for your moment of kitty zen. Okay, well, here's where we're at. I have finished seaming together the bodice, and you can see we've got linen. Each piece was made separately. I sewed them together with very, very small running stitches, as in Beata Ossana's bodice. And what we've actually ended up with, because we have the thin layer of blue linen, the thicker layer of white linen, and then we've got this lovely pink wool. And what we've ended up with, actually, this ends up being very much like boning, like very like soft and flexible boning, but it's got quite a bit of stiffness to it. And in the front, the ridge that was created by folding that all over and then attaching that facing has basically made a nice reinforced edge, so it's very sturdy. So there's really no need to put any kind of extra anything in this, any kind of extra pad stitching or other layers. This 3-layer application really gives you what you need to create the soft yet firm look of the 1480s to 1490s. So next steps. I think for this, I put it on, I tried it on, as you'll see in this overlay, and it was a little too tight around my arm area on the one side, because my right side, I favor my right side. And so I guess the musculature in this shoulder is bigger than the musculature in this shoulder, so I'm going to have to cut this arm's eye out a little bit more. But I'm going to do that after I have attached the lacing ring so that I can put it on, the bodice on, and lace it properly as it would be, and then get a real idea for how it feels. And I'm going to do that over top of a camicia. Remember, whenever you're doing fittings or trying things on as you go, and I do recommend when you are sewing a dress, please, please, please keep trying things on as you go, because things will shift. Once you add a seam, once you use different kinds of fabric, then the fabrics in which you patterned your garment, it's going to change things. So you want to keep trying it on as you go and make little adjustments so that you don't get to the end, have this beautifully finished garment, and you have to take everything apart to make it actually fit you properly. Big sewing tip from the Contessa, my dears. I'm going to attach the sewing rings. The lacing rings in front, these beautiful lacing rings from Billy and Charlie, and then I'm going to put it on over a camicia, lace it up, and see what might need to be adjusted before proceeding with finishing the edges here. And as for finishing the edges, I'm going to be doing a binding around the edges, as is found in Beata Ossana's Gamurra and also in the both the farsetto of Diego di Caviglia and his giornea, the facings were no longer attached, kind of binding facing. It's this combo thing where it kind of curls over the edge so you see it in the front a little bit and then more of it is in the back and tacked down. Anyway, that's what we're going to be doing to finish this off. But I want to make sure everything fits properly before I put any bindings or finish any of these edges. Project I'll be working on in parallel, or the step I'll be working on in parallel to that probably, because I can do one on the fly. I can take this with me to places, and when I'm standing around waiting, I can sew on lacing rings, whereas this big bulky piece of skirt is less easily pulled out and worked on, so I'll probably be doing them both at the same time. That's right, I can't just sit around and do nothing. That's not in my nature. So this is one of the skirt panels. It's the front panel, actually, and you'll notice it is in 2 pieces, and that is on purpose so that the opening for the lacing of the gown will align with the opening in a natural seam opening in this skirt, so that it will not cause any kind of, I won't have to cut into fabric. There'll be a nice strong finished seam that will just open naturally. And that also means that I now need to put a seam down the front. So I'm going to go ahead and put a seam down the center front. And I'm going to first though, we will be attaching the lining, and I'm doing this lining exactly as it is in Beata Osana's Gamurra. So her skirts are lined, but only down to mid-thigh. So that's where we're going with this, lining down to mid-thigh. And then for the hem, once I get all the skirt all pieced together and all the seams finished, etc., we're going to be going with a facing, just like a facing / guard, just like in the Beata Osana's Gamurra. So those are our next steps. Let's see how long this all takes. Friendly kitties. Città della Pieve kitties are so friendly. Yeah, 2-week project, 6-month project, whatever. We need time. What's time on a geologic scale? We are now on the road again, this time freshly arrived in Florence. The bodice has been completely sewn together with the interior seams turned and finished, so we are pushing ahead with, well, everything else, which I intend to accomplish largely here in Florence. But as in all wars of creativity, my plan does not long survive contact with the enemy. That being in this case, other projects, my new Burgundian silk velvet hood and silk damask belt specifically. When I next take the time to sit and sew on this project, I find myself on a visit to medieval Pistoia in full 15th century attire, where I work on sleeve lacing holes while we wait for lunch to be served in this gorgeous historic city. Over the next 2 months of travel, I do find time to continue working on the various pieces of this gown, but somehow never managed to really record while I was doing so. So we shall explore the details of all this in a bit via several dramatic recreations, but first, a progress report. Well, here we are back in Korea. The 2-week project has become almost a 6-month project. It's now early February. Let's cut up to speed, shall we? The bodice is nearly done. I have attached almost all of the lacing rings, which are a reproduction of an archaeological find. Plus, there's lots of visual evidence of these in various portraits, actual portraits, not, allegorical. Basically, I ended up settling on, well, not basically, I did end up settling on spiral lacing in the front. Once I finished the final lacing ring on that, which I attached using a sort of buttonhole stitch around the rings of the rings. And once we do that, then I guess I'm going to have to actually seriously ponder the finishing of all of these edges. So here's the deal, everyone. On Osana's Gamurra, basically this is just turned up, and then after the skirt is attached, it's finished with this band that goes all the way around. But my wool is very feisty, and it has created this really, because I rolled it under to make sure that those edges were all nice and clean, and I really did want that soft boning effect, right? But because I did that, it's now a bit like there's boning that goes all the way to the bottom here. So I'm either gonna have to trim away the bottom part of the rolled hem or the rolled seam, or I'm gonna have to come up with another finishing technique for the bottom, because just if I fold this in half now at the 3 points, 4, 5 points, because it's also then here in the front, you end up with these really thick points that are going to kind of press into my waist ahead of the rest of the bodice, and especially it's going to create extra bulk around my waistline, which I don't really want. So what I'm thinking is that I'm going to bind the bottom here also in the matching wool, and then I'm going to whip stitch the pleated skirts into that bottom bound edge. Now, I have no evidence for the 15th century that this was done. I have no visual evidence of it, and Osanna's Gamurra is not that way at all, but that may have to be the solution I'm going to have to come up with for this particular bodice, just because of the nature of, the way the seams have turned out, how thick they are and how heavy they are. And I definitely don't want that thickness doubling up. So basically the entire thing is going to be bound, and then I will attach the skirts, because the last thing I want to be doing is attach the skirts and then fiddle with the binding around all of these openings. So first we bind and finish up all of the various openings, and then we will attach the skirts. Sleeves. The sleeves, I ended up settling on a sleeve, and it's inside out so you can see the contrast a little bit better. I ended up settling on attaching, completely closing this upper part, at least for now, of the sleeve, the upper half of the sleeve. And then for the lower one, I actually went with spiral lacing all halfway up the sleeve. And then next I'm going to whip stitch this together so that you end up with this little space here through which snowy white linen will poof alluringly. We all know I like to have my snowy white linen. Hopefully it will be snowy and white. Oh, probably not, considering what I do to clothes. And it'll probably be more like grimy and sweat covered. Anyway, so we did spiral lacing, and there was definitely a remembrance curve. It's apparently been a while since I've done lacing holes, I guess. And you can definitely see a difference in the ones that I started with and the ones I ended with. Right. So that is where the sleeves are. Now, the nice thing about the whip stitching that I've done here is that if I decide, and I probably will later, that I want more openings along the upper part of the sleeve for alluring puffs of white, then I can just cut out the whip stitching and do other things. Cheeky self-promotion time. If you are enjoying this video, please hit the thumbs up and subscribe and the notification bell if you want to know when I launch new things. And if you want to do more to support my work, then consider the super thanks button on YouTube, or maybe becoming a patron on Patreon, which comes with a whole host of perks and extras like access to premium tutorials, multiple hour ones in fact, and discounts on classes. And now back to your regularly scheduled Contessa. Since we just discussed the sleeves, let us look at creating and finishing the lacing holes. Unfortunately, the extensive footage I captured of this part of the process was, generally useless from a visual perspective. It literally made me queasy to watch. I don't know what I was thinking when I set up the camera. Anyway, I will be rolling that out as a separate thing for people who just want to listen to me talk while I sew and maybe get something useful at some point. But for the purposes of visually demonstrating how I created the hole on these sleeves, here is a dramatic recreation. So first off, we take this handy dandy awl, which is actually part of my medieval eating kit. First, we use the awl to poke a hole in the fabric. Remember, never use a hole punch. This will remove precious fabric from your garment and create a weak spot that will tear out under pressure. By using the awl, we are actually pushing the fibers aside and creating a dense ring of material that will act like a fabric grommet. Next, we anchor our thread. I'm using doubled thread here because this is a high traffic zone, lots of in and out through this orifice. So I just go through and catch the knot at the end, anchoring the knot on the backside. We then use a whip stitch to secure the hole open, occasionally re-awling the hole and using those first several stitches to catch the tail of the thread. This secures it very nicely. As you work around the hole, make certain that you are catching all the layers of fabric in the stitch, because your fabrics are likely to try and misbehave in rebellion to your active sartorial control. Well, that's hideous, but that's okay. For the purposes of demonstration, it's fine, and it's not going to matter because we're about to cover this up. For the buttonhole stitch, we come up from underneath, just to the outside of the whip stitches, and then go down directly next to that first stitch, creating a horseshoe. I'm going to basically go through this loop from the outside of the circle straight into the center of the circle. And that basically kind of catches this and causes it to twist and create a little knot that then gets seated. And then I'm going to pull that knot that it's going to create towards the center. If you pull it back this way and put it around the edge, you'll open your hole up and make it bigger, which I guess if that's what you want to do, that's fine. But I really want that ridge that this is going to create, this buttonhole stitch is going to create, I want that ridge in the center of the hole acting like a fabric grommet, basically. And there it is. Definitely not the best work I've ever done, and I should have washed my hands before working with white thread, but it is a completed lace hole akin to the ones fastening this Gamurra's sleeve. Close up here. And now we're going to finish up the other sleeve, front of the other sleeve, by just doing a set of whip stitches to make a little connector here. Well, while we sew this relatively humble garment made of modest Republic-approved wool, let us chat about its more, sumptuous kin. In Florence, at any rate, gamurre were the simpler version of the base gown, with cotte representing the ostentatious option in the inventories. Starting at the end of the 13th century, Florence started attempting to control the rising ostentation, along with expenditures upon luxury items, through a series of statutes referred to now as sumptuary laws. Sumptus being the Latin word for expense or cost. The irony here, of course, is that Florence's economy came to be based on those same luxury goods whose purchase the government was hoping to restrain. Perhaps it was a bunch of elder statesmen who implemented these rules, the sort who believed that the youth were dissolute and would ruin the world with their so-called irresponsible fashions. Perhaps the government was hoping for an export economy rather than domestic sales, making money off of the moral dissolution of other polities. So I finish off my whip stitch by doing a couple of stitches around the bottom, then I create a knot around those bottom stitches, and then I bury my needle in the interstices of the sleeve. And when you turn the sleeve right side out, the whip stitches are not visible at all, but instead you have a nice flat seam. Okay, well, time to, as promised, lace up the bodice and see what's what. I can already feel it's a little tight in the arms, so I foresee some adjustments in our future. While we futz with the lacing, let us return to the topic of the fashion police. Interestingly, the preponderance of sartorial restrictions in the northern Italian city-states focused on constraining excesses of women's fashions rather than men's. Although, Florence did pass statutes in the early 15th century against men donning overly feminine attire. When the first laws limiting fashion excesses were passed in the late 13th century, the Commune required law-breaking garments that had been made before the law to be tagged with a lead seal, apparently in the hope that this would drive the owners to have new, sartorially compliant garments made. Other city-states, such as Siena and Bologna, also instituted their own sets of sumptuary legislation, but of course, the fines were really just the cost of participation. Wealthy families simply paid the fine, got a lead seal on their garments proving they had paid the fine, and went on about their day. And of course, such statutes had, as to be expected, the opposite effect on society, driving people to want more ostentatious rather than less, and prompting them to find new creative ways to, shall we say, detour around the statutes. Historian Giovanni Villani writes in the 14th century that, in spite of all these strong ordinances, outrages remained, and though one could not have cut and figured cloth, they wanted striped cloth and foreign cloth, the most that they could have, sending as far as Flanders and Brabant for it, not worrying about the cost. You may be surprised to hear, dear viewer, that the enforcement of such laws was not only challenging but, shall we say, selective. For instance, during Florentine communal events such as the Feast of San Giovanni, sumptuary restrictions were ignored by officials and families alike in order that the state might be glorified by the collective finery on display. Okay, well, otherwise it fits really well, I have to say. I am very happy with how flatly everything lays, how flattering it is on my figure, since this is a new pattern, so it all works out. Now you might notice there's a little bit of give here in the back. That's okay. Once we attach the sleeves and they go on my back, that will pull that flat outward like that. Fitting tip, when you have a gown like this and you want to check to make sure that the arm's eye is not too tight, what you really want to do is you want to make sure that you put your arms forward like so. I mean, only if you want to move your arms. If you have no problem keeping your arms here the entire time you're wearing an ensemble, then please, by all means, skip this step. But if you enjoy mobility, as I do, limited as it may be by the general nature of historical clothing, put your arm forward. One can actually see that it's binding me right here, cutting into my arm really tightly. I then use tailor's soap to mark the respective spots needed for ease on both sides. This will no doubt give me asymmetrical markings to reflect my asymmetrical body. But I will end up applying to both sides the set of marks that offers the most room, since I do not want one arm's eye shoulder strap to be visibly narrower than the other. I end up applying the roomier right-hand side markings to the left and cut out both, and then try the garment on again, only to discover that I need a bit more room still a little lower down in the arm's eye, which I mark and cut out. Okay, it's all good now. I can put my arms forward like this if I wanted to, I don't know, strangle someone, I suppose. It's interesting that it's a violent thought that comes to my head as an action I might have to commit. 6-month project? Nay. More like, I can do math. It's definitely become a 9-month project at this point. Our next exciting episode will find us half a planet away in the greater Seattle area, where we will work on assembling the skirts, binding the edges of the bodice, and, who knows, maybe even bringing this damned project to completion, although probably not. Have any of my ramblings helped you in any of your creative endeavors? Let me know in the comments below. Otherwise, until next time, stay creative and stay tuned for your moment of kitty zen.
Meow meow. Meow meow. Meow meow. Kitty kitty. Kitty kitty. Meow meow. Meow.
Now that we have our undergarments in place to protect our overlayers from, well, our skin's own corrosive influence, we move on to the Gamurra, or cotta, the basic foundational gown worn by all classes of women. While I wrestle with these laces and the gown in general, let us discuss the details. What distinguishes this garment from social class to social class are the materials from which it is constructed, ranging from linen and low-grade wool to heavy, sumptuous figured silks and rich doeskin wool with its graceful fluidity. Doeskin was in fact one of Florence's great exports. This particular cotta is made of a green taffeta and flatlined in a luminescent golden silk tabby weave. Doing so is a practice attested in Lorenzo de' Medici's inventories. This gown is laced up in the front with 3 different sets of laces, which are made of black silk and have been fingerloop woven by hand by yours truly. Fingerloop weaving was a frequent form of entertainment for both ladies and, unfortunately, for their house tigers. Looking at you, Huagu. The lacing rings are gilt cast pewter and are replicas of originals, made by Billy and Charlie's Fine Pewters. When intended to amaze crowds outside the home, and therefore prove just how puissant and honorable a family was, honor had a different meaning, obviously, for the Florentines. Such gowns are frequently embellished with embroidery, jewels, and applique. However, it is rare that a lady is seen by non-relatives in this layer. So rare, in fact, that Lucrezia Medici, née Tornabuoni, Lorenzo de' Medici's mother, writes to her son about having glimpsed a young Clarice Orsini in her Gamurra, noting that the young woman had a fine figure, and of course implying that she would make a good mother for future Medici scions. Ah, mothers as meat market brokers, some things never change. In a collaborative effort whose flowchart would resemble a metastatic hydra, gowns such as these were constructed by a host of artisans, with individual craftsmen being in charge of specific components. Professional tailors, seamers, embroiders, furriers, jewelers. An upper-class gown often involved a cast of dozens. As an aside, the bottom rungs of society frequently ended up with the second-hand linen and wool cast-offs of their betters, which could be purchased in the thriving rigattieri markets found in every town and city, much like today's flea markets. And yet, also unlike today's flea markets, today's second-hand shoppers ironically tend to be the affluent, seeking hipster vintage in a bid to signal irony or something. No Medici would have been caught dead in someone else's cast-offs, irony or no irony. Well, now that that ordeal is done, we still have the sleeves, which is actually, honestly, the hardest part. So I'm going to require some assistance for this, obviously. Now on to the sleeves. The sleeves' complex set of lacings require the assistance of a dame d'honneur. But in these times of plague, the resident condottiero shall just have to do. Thankfully, I've trained him. Although generally of the same shape, sleeves can feature a variety of openings and slits intended to reveal the snow white of the camicia underneath. A risque display of the most intimate layer of clothing. Oh my. Often, the left sleeve is decorated with ornate embroidery representing the arms of the house and labeling its wearer as a member thereof. Clothing branding is nothing new, except I think it was possibly more tasteful back then. And probably less commercial. Maybe less commercial. Meat market, it was commercial. Now, back to business. Sometimes the sleeves might be detachable and affixed by means of laces or pins, while others are simply detached from one dress and whip-stitched onto another by nimble fingers. When one has a host of servants, such labor is no inconvenience to the lady being dressed. As an aside, I currently have no such ladies' maids in residence, sadly. Sad, sad Contessa. You can see up close as my condottiero deftly does up my ties, utilizing a knot that some people call an arming knot. It's basically an overhand knot that can be easily undone by simply pulling on those little metal egglets that are dangling there so alluringly. And there it is. The dress is completely laced, and it looks delightful, but as delightful as it looks, this is definitely nowhere near to being fully dressed. I could go about my house attired this way, but definitely not leave. Next layer coming up, and here's a close-up of the gorgeous embroidery that I fashioned myself. No vanity here. No pride either. Well, here we go with the dramatic recreation of making a lacing hole. So first off, we take this handy dandy awl, which is actually part of my medieval eating kit. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to use the awl to poke the hole, and you're going to see just how efficient this awl is at doing this. Now I don't want to poke too far because I don't want the hole to be too big. So the first thing we're going to do is, of course, anchor our thread. And I'm going to do that by actually going up from below. And this is double thread because lace holes take a lot of wear and tear, so I like to double up the thread. And then I'm actually going to go through the loop, catch that knot, and seat that knot here on the underside. Okay. And now what we're going to do, whenever you're doing lace holes, you will probably have to use your awl to open up the lace hole as you go around the first layer of stitching, which in this case is going to be a whip stitch. We are going to do a simple whip stitch around the hole to catch everything together, anchor the hole open, and then once we have it all nice and anchored open with a simple whip stitch, we can then go about with the prettier button stitch, which will also add firmness and create a sort of fabric ring. Now, you want to make certain, which is why you notice I keep flipping it upside down to check. You want to make certain that you get through all of the layers and not that you don't miss one of the layers with the whip stitches. And a whip stitch, for those who don't know, is where you just go around and around and around. So let us whip. And I'm actually using the whip stitches to catch the tail of my thread, the tails that were on the other side of the knot, so that everything gets contained within the whip stitches, so that it makes it much less likely that your knot will come undone, that the thread will slip through if it's all anchored under. Okay, well, that's hideous, but that's okay. For the purposes of demonstration, it's fine, and it's not going to matter because we're about to cover this up. So our next phase, now that we've anchored our hole open, so at this point you shouldn't really need to awl anymore. This is the point where you can say to yourself, well, actually, I want the hole to be a little bigger, and you can make it a little bigger now. And then once you've done your buttonhole stitches, that's it, it's done. So for the buttonhole stitch, I am going to come up to just the outside of where I placed my whip stitches. And then I'm going to go down right next to where I came up on the same side. And I'm going to make a little horseshoe. You can see how that's twisted. The thread is twisted. I'm going to come up behind it. And then I'm going to pull that knot that it's going to create towards the center, tangential to the line of the circle, sort of across its diameter, as it were, and put that in the center, not around the edge. If you pull it back this way and put it around the edge, you'll open your hole up and make it bigger, which I guess if that's what you want to do, that's fine. But I really want that ridge that this is going to create, this buttonhole stitch is going to create, I want that ridge in the center of the hole acting like a fabric grommet, basically. So again, I come around the back, create that loop, and then pull it forward. And then just keep going. And I thought I would go back and just clarify. So I'm working in a clockwise direction. So when I say go around the back to catch it, what I mean is I come around so I've come up through the center. I'm going to take my needle and I'm going to basically go through this loop from the outside of the circle straight into the center of the circle. And that basically kind of catches this and causes it to twist and create a little knot that then gets seated at the base. And of course, it's about here that technology utterly fails me. My mic stops recording. The joys of being a one-person production team mean that there was no one to tell me that. So we're going to do a recreational voiceover for this section. Note that if you are working with white thread, you should wash your hands thoroughly with soap and water before you start sewing with it, otherwise you will turn it gray, as I have done here. The oils on our skin naturally collect detritus from the environment, and that transfers perfectly onto white silk thread. Once you get all the way around and you have completed your ring, we will now proceed to the next step, namely finishing this baby. Okay, so now we're going to take our needle down through the center and bring it to the back side. We will form a knot here on the back. And then we're going to bury the needle and therefore also bury the thread by going through multiple of the stitches that we've laid along the back of the eyelet stitches.
and then pulling the needle through to use those eyelet stitches to hold it securely in place. And now we're going to actually, if we were working on a row of eyelets at this point, I would actually just go between the lining and the shell fabric to come up to the next spot where I need to start my next eyelet, thereby not having to create a new anchor stitch, and also creating more security in the thread between the various eyelets because it's less likely to break or fray or snap in between those layers. And that's how you make an eyelet from medieval to modern. Let me know if you have any questions in the comments below. Otherwise, until next time, stay creative, guys. Bye.
Who's a pretty kitty? Meow meow. Meow meow. 정덕궁 kitty. Meow meow.